One of the steps that was taken to address horrible misbehavior where there were no costs, where there was impunity, was in Russia in the case of Sergei Magnitsky. And so maybe, Vladimir, you could just say a word about the kind of underlying logic of the Magnitsky Law and now how it's being, you alluded to some of these more recent initiatives, how you've seen that progress as a way of sending a signal and addressing some of the things that I think Suat is suggesting.
Thank you for the question, Chris, and thank you for raising this issue. And this question of cost is very important. And the Magnitsky Law, apart from being principled, apart from being honorable, apart from being very effective, also introduced a groundbreaking notion in international practice. It actually assigned responsibility for these abuses, for human rights abuses, for corruption, where it's actually due. Instead of punishing an entire country for the actions of a small unelected clique that misrules that country, it goes directly after them. And in the case of Russia, again, we talked about the many similarities that exist today between what happened under the Soviet regime and what's happening under the Putin regime. And there are many similarities, certainly political prisoners, media censorship, election fraud, and so on and so forth. But there is this added feature that the people who are in charge of this regime and who are on a daily basis violating and undermining and breaking the norms of the civilized democratic world want to use the privileges of the civilized democratic world for themselves and for their families and for their personal enrichment and for their lifestyle and for their gain. And this is an absolutely amazing instrument, the Magnitsky Act, that assigns responsibility where it's due, that ends the impunity. I remember on the day the Magnitsky Act was being passed in America, it was November the 16th, 2012. The third anniversary of the death of Sergei Magnitsky in a Moscow prison. And Boris Nemtsov and I were sitting in the visitors' gallery in the US House of Representatives watching them vote on this. And Boris said that day, he said, when we have democracy and the rule of law in our country again, I will be the first one, he spoke about himself, he said, I will be the first person to go back to all these Western capitals where I went advocating for the Magnitsky Law to advocate for its repeal, because we will no longer need it, because we will have a real justice system and rule of law system that will be able to take care of the scoundrels and the criminals and the crooks and the corrupt officials. For now, we do not have that. And so the Magnitsky Act is a necessary step to end this impunity, to end this double standard. And I want to recognize, he just walked in the room, my very good friend Erwin Kotler, who is responsible in an enormous way for the fact that Canada in the next few weeks will hopefully become the third country in the world to pass its own Magnitsky Act. Erwin, where are you? You're hiding somewhere.
Ah, there's Erwin.
Don't hide. There he is, the former Minister of Justice of Canada. And as I said before, we hope to see other Western countries follow this lead. And it's also very important to distinguish between general sanctions and personal targeted sanctions. We do not advocate sanctions against Russia. I'm a Russian citizen. I'm not for sanctions on my own country. But I am for sanctions against the people who violate the rights of the people of my country and who steal from the people of my country. And this is what the Magnitsky Law is about. And I want to very quickly mention the point that Foreign Minister Dion mentioned in his remarks, which I think is a very important one. It's not only about punishing the wrongdoers and the crooks, it's also about supporting when something good is happening. And I guess as a historian, I'm biased to trying to learn lessons from history, but I think it's important to learn from history to prepare for the future. And one of the major reasons, I think, not the main one, but at least a very important one nevertheless, reason for the failure of Russia's democratic transition back in the 90s, in the early 90s, was the lack of a will in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic community to welcome a new democratic Russia into its ranks as a full member. Václav Havel, the founder of this forum and the president of this nation, called the entire post-communist transformation of countries who transitioned from being Soviet satellites to being democracies, he called this process a return to Europe. Because needless to say, this prospect of fully rejoining the European and Euro-Atlantic community served as a very powerful incentive for reforms in the Baltic states, in Central and Eastern Europe, and many other countries. We never had that. On the 26th of December 1991, one day after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, there was a NATO ambassadors meeting in Brussels at NATO headquarters. And a letter was delivered from Russian President Boris Yeltsin addressed to NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner, in which the President of Russia raised the question of future Russian membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He did not even receive a response. And so we never had, back in the 90s, that incentive of returning to Europe, as Václav Havel said it. I think it's a very, I'm not in any way suggesting this was the main reason for the failure of the Russian democratic transition. The main failures lie with us. But this was nevertheless an important factor that contributed to it. And I very much hope that the next time Russia has an opportunity, and that day will come, Russia has an opportunity to engage on genuine democratic transition, that our friends and neighbors in Europe stand ready to welcome a democratic Russia into their ranks as a full member.
Thank you, Vladimir.